Book 4 of Chapter 9 of Clara Vaughan, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. Clara Vaughan, Volume 2, by R.D. Blackmore. Book 4, Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Story of Edgar Vaughan. Let me hold myself, weak as I am and crippled by premature old age. Not the shortness of my breath, not the numbness of my heart, not even the palsy of my frame, can quench or check the fire rekindled by the mere name of that heavenly valley. To live there only half a minute is worth a day of English life. Life. It is a space to measure, not by pendulum or clock hand, not by our own strides to and fro, the ordnance scale of the million, not even by the rolling sun and nature's hail and farewell, but by the wellspring of ourselves, the fount of thought and feeling. Every single breath I draw of this living air, the bride of earth our sire, wedded to him by God Creator, air whose mother milk we fight for in clusters balking one another. Every breath I draw dances with a buoyant virtue, sucked in any other land but from mountain nipples. Bright air of a rosy blue, where northern eyes are dazed with beauty, where every flower cuts stars of light, and every cloud is sunshine's step. Can even lovers parted thus believe themselves divided? Every rock has its myrtle favour, every tree its clematis wreath. Under the cistus and oleander hides the pink to lace its bodice, watched by the pansy's sprightly eye. Lavishly as children's bubbles hover overhead oranges and citrons, lemons, almonds, figs, varied by the blushing peach and the purpling grape. Far behind and leaning forth, the swarthy bosom of the mountain, whose white head leans on the heaven, are ranks on ranks of glaucous olive, giants of a green old age dashed with silver grey. And oh, the fragrance underfoot, the tribute of the ground, which Corsica's great sun, as we men measure greatness, pined for in the barren isle, where the iron of his selfishness entered his own soul. These are said to be the largest olive trees in the world, and of the very best varieties. Heaps upon heaps the rich fruit lies at the foot of the glorious tree. Nature is too bountiful for man to heed her gifts. For this district of Bologna and that of Nebbio further north, my attention had been especially bespoken by my shrewd and sagacious friend. Therefore, and by reason of the charms around me, here I resolved to pass the summer. So my vessel was laid up at Calvi, and being quartered in Belgodere, at a little inn, Locanda it should be called, but I hate interlarding, I addressed myself right heartily to business and to pleasure. First, I had to study the grand Palladian gift. Unless old Seneca was, as the Corsicans say, a great liar, he cannot have been the author of that epigram which declares this land a stranger to the peaceful boon. It is impossible to believe that a country so adapted to that tree, so often colonized by cultured races, can have been so long ungifted with its staff of life. The island itself in that same epigram is utterly misdescribed. As regards the inhabitants, the first line of the well-known couplet is verified by ages. To the second it does not plead guilty now, and probably never did. Law the first revenge, law the second to live by robbery, law the third to lie, the fourth to deny any gods. The Corsicans, on the contrary, have always been famous for candour, whose very soul is truth, and for superstition, the wen or hump of religion. For my own part, loving not that unprincipled fellow hard labour, towards whom these noble islanders entertain a like antipathy, and loving much any freedom not hostile to my own, I got on with the natives admirably for a certain time. Time had reconciled me to their customs of carrying, instead of cane or umbrella, long double-barrelled guns, whose muzzle they afford the stranger full opportunity of inspecting. First-rate marksmen are they, but they sling their guns at haphazard on their backs, and cheek to jowl we come upon the cold metal at the corner of the narrow streets. Tall and powerful men they are, especially the mountaineers, with all the Spaniard's dignity and the Italian's native grace. The women are lithe, erect, and beautifully formed, with a swan-like carriage and a free and courteous bearing, such as very few of our high-born damsels own. Labor improbus of Virgil. The olive growers frankly gave me all their little information about that tree, whose typical virtues they have never cared to learn. The variety chiefly grown, or rather which chiefly grows itself, is one they call the Genoese. The owners afford them very little culture, and many are too idle even to collect the fruit. There are said to be 10 million olive trees in the island, at least they were reckoned up to that number by order of the government. Then the enumerators grew tired and left off counting. Whatever number there is might easily be tripled, if anyone had the energy to graft the oleasters, with which the hills are covered. There is also the Saracen olive and the Sabine, the latter perhaps the Regia of Columella, Rajaria of Caesalpinus, and Radius of Virgil. However, though not unlike my sample fruit, it was not quite identical, and as my employers wanted a very special sort for very special qualities, I was as far from my object as ever. One magnificent summer evening, as I rode along the mountain side near the village of Speloncato, suddenly the track turned sharply into a wooded dingle. Steeped in the dream of nature's beauty, I was thinking of nothing at all, as becomes a true Corsican, when I received a sharpish knock in the eye. Something fell and lodged in my capacious beard. Smarting from the pain, I caught it, and not being able to see clearly, took it at first for a spent and dropping bullet. But when my eyes had ceased to water, I found in my hand a half-grown olive, of the very kind I had so long been seeking. I drew forth some of my London specimens, which had been chemically treated to prevent their shrivelling, and compared it narrowly. Yes, there could be no doubt. The same pyriform curve, the same bulge near the peduncle, the same violet lines in the skin, and when cut open, the same granulation and nucleus. I was truly delighted. At length I should be of some real service, at least if there were many trees here of this most rare variety. By riding up the dingle, I soon ascertained that it was planted with trees of this sort only, grey old trees, of a different habit from any other olive. Afterwards I found that it requires a different soil and a different aspect. Full speed I galloped back to the hamlet of Speloncato, and inquired for the owner of this olive Eldorado. Signor Dezio della Croce, owner of all this lovely slope, and of large estates extending as far as the road to Corte, in fact the chief proprietor of the neighbourhood. He was, said the peasant with some pride, a true descendant of the great race of Chinarca, foremost in the island annals for 1,000 years, and of whom was the famous Guidice della Rocca, Count and Judge of Corsica 600 years ago. At the sound of his name, Giudice opened his great sleepy eyes and pricked his ears. I promised not to interrupt, but he gave no such pledge. Let the Chinarchesi blood go for its full value, but it was worth something to the Della Croce to be descended also from the Tuscan Malvinas, for the lands of those great Marqueses were now in possession of the Signor Dezio. And the Signor has such a daughter, a young maiden, ah Madonna, the loveliest girl in Corsica. And the vine dresser crossed himself. As I listened to all this information, I began to look through my unused credentials, which I always carried. It struck me that this name of Della Croce was quite familiar to me, though I knew not how, until a letter in the sprawling hand of young Lawrence Daldy fell out from among Peter's crabbed characters. Lawrence Daldy, my mother's younger son, was now in full career as a pigeon and a guardsman, spending at full gallop his dead father's money. These Daldys were of Italian origin, the true name being Daldis, which after some years of English life they had naturalised into Daldy. And now I recollected that when we Vaughan boys scorned them as ignoble sons of commerce, they used to brag about their kinship to the ancient Della Croce. Riding up the forest hill, on whose western bluff stands boldly the grey old tower of the Malvinas, I began of course to make forecasts about the character of my host. My host I knew he needs must be, for Corsica is all of the world the most hospitable spot. Although by this time well acquainted with the simple island habits, I could not but expect to find a man of stateliness and surroundings, of stiffness and some arrogance. Now the sun was setting, and the western fire from off the sea glanced in spears of reddening gold into the solemn, time-worn keep. All things looked majestic, but a deal too lonely. Where was I to apply? How was I to get in? The narrow doorway, overhung with the wreck of some portcullis, was blocked instead with a sort of mantlet like the Roman vinea. The loopholes on the ground tier were boarded almost to the top. The high windows, such as they were, had their rough shutters closed. Everything betokened a state of siege and fear. 2 or 3 magnificent chestnuts, which must have commanded the front of the tower, had been cut down and added to the defences of the approach. Over these I managed at last to leap my horse, who was by no means a perfect hunter, and there I halted at a loss how to proceed. I had been long enough in Corsica to know, even without a certain ominous gleam from a loophole, and the view in transverse section of a large double-barrelled gun, that the owner of this old mansion was now in the pleasant state of vendetta. Expecting every moment to be shot and nothing said about it, I waved my letter as a white flag furiously above my head. Presently that frightful muzzle was withdrawn and the slide pushed back, to reconnoitre me at leisure. I tried, for the first time in my life, to look like a real Briton. My Corsican ambition was already on the wane. So I sat my horse and waited, and what came was worth 1,000 years of waiting. Round the bastion of the tower, under the rich magnolia bloom, towards me glided through the rosy shadow the loveliest being that ever moved outside the gates of heaven. She seemed not to walk, but waft along, like the pearly nautilus. A pink mandile of lightest gauze lit the sable of her clustering hair, and wreathing round her graceful head deepened the tinge of the nestling cheeks. The lithe faldetta of white cashmere, thrown hastily over the shoulders, half concealed the flowing curves of the slender supple form, half betrayed them as it followed every facile motion. But when she smiled, oh, Clara! I would have leaped from her father's towers or into the black caves of the Restonica for one smile of hers. The dark fringed lustre of her eyes seemed to dance with golden joy, trusting, hoping, loving all things, pleasure pleased at pleasing. And the gleesome arch of her laughing lips, that never shaped evil word, "Oh, my Lily, my own Lily, I shall see you soon again." My dear Clara, I ought to know better. I am ashamed of myself. And after so many years. But at the first glance of Fiordalisa my fate was fixed for this life and the other. I never had loved before. I never had cared to look at a girl. In fact, I despised them all. Now I paid for that contemptuous folly. Loving at one glance, loving once, for all, for ever. My heart stood still like the focus of a hurricane. My speech and every power but that of vision failed me. I dared not try to leave the saddle. Such a trembling took me. It was a visitation unknown in our foggy plains, scoffed at by our prosy race, but known full well in southern climes, as the sunstroke of love. My own darling, I can call her nothing less, my own delicious darling was quite startled at me. Whether she had a like visitation in a milder form is more than I can say, but I hope with all my heart she had, for then, as the southern tale recites, God placed her hand in mine. How I got my horse tied up, how I followed her through the side entrance, and returned her father's greeting, I have not the least idea. All I know is that she smiled, and I wanted nothing more. But I could not bear to see her in the true Homeric fashion still maintained in Corsica, waiting on us like a common servant, with her beautiful arched feet glancing under the brown pelone, and her tapering white arms laid demurely on her bosom. Then, at her father's signal, how she flew for the purple grapes or the fragrant broccio! But do what she would, it seemed to become her more than all she had done before. As that form of love and elegance flitted through the simple room, and those lustrous heavenly eyes beamed with hospitable warmth, Signor Dezio della Croce, careworn man with beard of snow, seemed at times no little proud of his sweet and only child, but was too proud to show his pride. As for me, he must have thought that I spoke very poor Italian. End of Book 4, Chapter 9.